The Happy Writing Murder Club, a thrilling journey into darkness. Have you ever felt like you're trapped in a never-ending nightmare? What if you couldn't escape even when you thought you had? Join Megan as she faces an unimaginable force that haunts her every step. But beware, nothing is what it seems, and the darkness may be closer than you think. Will she ever break free, or is there something far more sinister waiting for her? Watch until the end to discover the shocking truth. The wind howled through the cracked windows. The house creaked and groaned under its weight. Megan stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the air. The silence that followed the storm was deafening. The faintest noise echoed from upstairs. A soft shuffle. Her breath caught in her throat. She reached for the light switch but hesitated. The bulb flickered before dimming entirely. Darkness. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Her fingers brushed the cold, rough wall. Every step felt like an eternity. Her foot landed on something sharp. She gasped, stumbling back. The floor beneath her was slick. With what? She didn't dare look down. A distant sound, like something scraping against wood, sent a shiver up her spine. She forced herself to move slowly, carefully. The stairs creaked under her weight. Up, one step at a time. Her pulse thumped in her ears, drowning out all other sound. At the top, the hallway stretched dark and endless. A door at the far end stood ajar. A faint light flickered within. She edged toward it. Closer. Closer still. A shadow shifted across the light. Her blood ran cold. Was someone in there? Megan swallowed hard, her throat dry. She reached for the doorknob, but it twisted on its own. The door swung open with a screech. She froze. A figure stood in the center of the room. Back to her. A figure with a long, dark coat. Their head was tilted downward. A soft whisper filled the air. Megan, her name, in a voice she knew all too well. Her body refused to move. The figure turned slowly. A familiar face, pale and hollow-eyed. Her own face. "Why did you leave me?" it whispered. Megan's breath hitched. The room felt smaller, suffocating. Her heart raced, faster now. A noise. A crack behind her. The door slammed shut. Megan spun around, her chest tightening. The room was pitch black again. The door was gone. Gone. Nothing but walls now. The figure behind her, that hollow-eyed reflection, moved closer. Her pulse thundered in her ears. "Don't run," it whispered, a rasp in its voice. Megan stepped back, tripping over something soft. A muffled cry escaped her lips. Her eyes darted to the floor. A pile of old books, scattered and half-destroyed. The air was thick with the smell of dust and mildew. Her breath quickened. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The figure stood waiting for her to make the next move. Slowly, she backed toward the far corner of the room. Her hands shook as she touched the cold, rough walls. Suddenly, a sharp, hollow knock echoed from somewhere far away. Her gaze snapped to the far side of the room. The window. It was cracked open just a sliver. The wind was back, sharp and biting. A shadow passed quickly outside. A face. A face she recognized. Her pulse faltered. Was it? No, it couldn't be. But the face, it was so familiar. The reflection in the corner shifted again. It was moving, coming toward her. Closer, closer, closer. Megan stumbled back. She tripped over the broken books. Her hand landed on something cold. A knife. The edge was worn but sharp. She gripped it tightly. The figure's eyes gleamed with something darker now. Something hungrier. "Do you remember me?" it asked. Its voice cracked like brittle paper. Megan's chest felt tight, too tight to breathe. Her fingers curled around the knife, instinct kicking in. She didn't know what was real anymore. The air around her felt thick, suffocating. The whispering grew louder, coming from all sides. "Run, Megan. The floor beneath her seemed to shift. The room started to tilt. Tilted like a falling ship. She couldn't steady herself. The figure's pale face loomed in front of her. Her hand, trembling, lifted the knife. The reflection smiled. The smile twisted, crooked and unnatural. Megan's grip on the knife tightened, her fingers numb. The figure's hollow eyes locked with hers. "Do it," it hissed. The room tilted further, the walls closing in. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She couldn't escape. Her mind screamed for clarity, but there was only chaos. She lunged forward, knife raised, instinct taking over. The figure didn't move. It stood still, waiting. Megan's hand shook violently as the blade came down, but the knife didn't meet flesh. It passed through the figure like smoke. Her heart stuttered. A cold, icy chill filled the room. The figure's face contorted, distorting into something worse. Something darker. Its mouth opened wide, far too wide. A guttural sound erupted from it, a screech that made her stomach churn. Megan stumbled back, nearly losing her footing. Her chest burned. The air was thick, suffocating. The walls seemed to close in, pressing against her chest. Her vision blurred, and she felt lightheaded. Suddenly, the screech stopped. The room fell silent again. Too silent. The floor beneath her cracked open with a loud snap. A black void stretched beneath her feet. Megan gasped, stepping back instinctively. Her heart raced. A terrible force tugged at her. She looked around, but there was no escape. The figure was gone. For a moment, the room seemed peaceful. Too peaceful. But the silence was suffocating. The air had changed. Heavy, darker. Her hands were still trembling. She looked down at the knife. A faint red smear coated the blade. Had she? She froze. The shadow in the corner flickered. Too quickly. Something moved behind her. She spun around. Nothing. Just the faintest sound of breathing. And then a whisper. "Not yet, Megan." The walls seemed to pulse. The floor groaned beneath her feet. The light overhead flickered. A figure, her reflection, appeared again. But this time, it wasn't the same. Its eyes were wide, panicked, and it wasn't her. The figure's eyes were wild, desperate. It reached out toward her, trembling. "Megan, help me," it pleaded, its voice a fractured whisper. But the voice, she didn't recognize it. Her heart skipped a beat. The reflection wasn't her own. It was someone else. Someone she couldn't place. The figure's face twisted in pain, as if trying to scream, but no sound came out. Megan stumbled backward, her pulse racing. Her mind was spinning, her vision blurred. The figure lurched toward her, its hands reaching for her. She froze. The room seemed to pulse with energy. The floor vibrated beneath her. She couldn't breathe. The reflection, the stranger's face, was so close now, its eyes locked with hers. "Megan, help me," it repeated, but it wasn't her voice. It wasn't her at all. She had to move, had to escape, but her legs wouldn't respond. The shadow loomed larger, closer, closer. A cold, unearthly chill swept through her body. Megan snapped out of her daze. Her legs moved, unsteadily at first, but they carried her toward the door. She reached for the handle, her hand trembling. It wouldn't budge. It was stuck. Her breath came in ragged gasps as the figure lurched behind her. She could hear its ragged breathing now. It was getting closer. She slammed her shoulder into the door, again and again. The handle twisted under her force. Finally, it gave way. The door flew open. Light spilled in from the hallway, but there was no escape, no way out. The hallway was just as dark, just as endless. Megan's heart pounded in her chest. She turned to look back, just for a second. The figure was gone. No more twisted face. No more pleading. But the air was heavier now. The space felt wrong. Everything was wrong. Her fingers grazed the walls as she backed into the hallway. She had to keep moving. Her breathing was shallow, her mind numb. But the feeling of being watched never left. The chill never left. Something was still there, in the darkness, and it was waiting. Megan's footsteps echoed down the hallway, too loud, too frantic. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on her. The walls seemed to press in, narrowing with every step she took. The air grew colder. She stopped. A sound, a faint scraping noise behind her. She turned sharply. Nothing. Just the endless stretch of hallway. The faint glow of a distant light at the end. Her breath caught. The scraping noise was back. Closer this time. It sounded like nails against stone. Her legs froze. She couldn't move. Her body refused to obey. A shadow flickered at the corner of her vision, just at the edge of the light. Her eyes snapped to it. Nothing. Her heartbeat thundered in her chest. The scraping continued, now louder, closer. She couldn't stay here. She forced herself to move, one shaky step at a time. Each footfall seemed heavier than the last. The shadow was back. This time it was unmistakable. A figure, tall and thin, moving toward her. It was slow, deliberate, and it was smiling. The smile was wide, too wide. It stretched unnaturally, like it didn't belong. Megan's legs screamed at her to run. She turned, but her feet felt glued to the floor. The figure was getting closer, closer and closer. Its eyes were empty, black pits that seemed to pull her in. She stumbled backward, frantic, but her legs gave out. She hit the floor with a thud. The sound of scraping nails grew louder. It was right behind her. A cold, clammy hand brushed her shoulder. She gasped, her whole body seizing in terror. Her breath caught in her throat. A voice, soft and cruel, whispered in her ear. "Don't look back." Her body locked, frozen with dread. But the voice wasn't the worst part. It was the laughter that followed, low, eerie, ringing in her skull. Megan couldn't fight it. She couldn't move. The figure crouched beside her. Its face was inches from hers now. The smile wider, the laughter louder. The darkness around her deepened. It swallowed everything. The darkness swallowed her whole. No light, no sound, nothing. Megan's body floated weightless, lost in the void. Her mind felt detached, as if her thoughts weren't her own anymore. Her breath was shallow, cold. Her fingers twitched. Something was there, something that shouldn't be. A flicker of light, a distant glow, faint but steady. It pulsed like a heartbeat. Megan's chest tightened. She reached for it, her hands moving without her command. The light grew brighter as she drew closer. Her heart raced. Her vision cleared just enough to see a door, standing alone in the middle of the vast nothingness. It was cracked open, a thin sliver of light spilling from the gap. She didn't think. She ran toward it. Her feet hit the ground, though she couldn't feel it. Her body moved, almost in a panic. Closer, closer. The door loomed ahead, waiting. With a final burst of energy, she reached the door, her hand outstretched. Her fingers brushed the cold metal handle. It turned in her grasp. The door creaked open, but as it did, the light disappeared, swallowed by an overwhelming darkness. The cold seeped back into her bones. A heavy presence filled the air. Megan stepped through, but the door slammed shut behind her. A sharp, metallic sound. The room was empty. Bare walls, empty floor, no windows, no exit. Her breath echoed, loud in the silence. She turned, but there was nothing to see. The walls, smooth and oppressive, closed in on her. Her heart thundered. Something was in here. The shadow, the figure it had followed her. She could feel its presence, creeping in the corners of the room. A low, unsettling whisper filled the space. Megan, her name, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. Do you think you're free? Her legs wobbled beneath her, but she couldn't move. Her skin tingled, the hairs on her arms rising. The air was thick with tension. Something brushed against her neck. Cold, so cold. She turned, but nothing was there. The whisper grew louder, closer, closer still, until the voice was right behind her. Megan. The room seemed to stretch, distort. The walls twisted, warping like melting wax. The floor split open with a thunderous crack, and the darkness reached out. The darkness surged forward, swallowing the room whole. Megan's breath hitched in her throat as the cold seeped into her skin, freezing her from the inside out. The floor buckled beneath her feet. She stumbled, her body fighting against the weight of the air. The walls, no, the whole room was alive. It was breathing. The shadows writhed, like living things, crawling toward her, closing in. Her vision blurred, the light from the cracked door fading into nothing. The whispering didn't stop. It was all around her now, growing louder, growing sharper. Megan, the voice, her name, was twisted, now a guttural rasp, like nails scraping against stone. She wanted to scream, but her throat was tight, paralyzed. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadows thickened, wrapping around her like chains. She could feel them pulling her, dragging her toward the center of the room. Her body screamed for escape, but her legs refused to cooperate. Her heart hammered wildly, the only sound she could hear. The shadows pressed closer, their coldness seeping deeper. Then, from the depths of the dark, a figure emerged. It was her. No, asterisk it asterisk was her, but not quite. This one was twisted, hollow-eyed, a mockery of herself. The figure's grin stretched wider, impossibly wide, its smile leaking darkness. Megan, it hissed again, its voice splitting the silence. The air around her seemed to grow heavier, suffocating her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. It was everywhere now. The whisper, the shadows, the figure. Her reflection, the thing that wore her face. It reached toward her, its cold fingers grazing her cheek. Megan's skin burned where it touched. The reflection's eyes were filled with darkness, hollow and empty. Asterisk you asterisk are the one who never left, it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. You never escaped. The room spun. The ground beneath her buckled, splitting open with a deafening crack. The void beneath her was endless, black as pitch. Megan's legs gave out, and she fell into the abyss. The shadows reached for her, pulling her down, down into the depths. She screamed, but no sound escaped, just darkness, and the unrelenting whisper. Megan, closer, closer, until nothing remained but the cold, endless dark. The darkness pressed in, suffocating, absolute. Megan's mind scrambled for something to hold on to, anything. Her body was weightless, falling through an endless void. Her chest felt tight, as if her very lungs were being crushed. Her thoughts were scattered, her memories slipping away like sand through her fingers. The whisper, her name, echoed again, sharp and cruel. Megan. The voice was familiar, but it was wrong. Twisted, it wrapped itself around her, tugging at her insides. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came. The cold was unbearable, crawling deeper, past her skin, into her bones. Her eyes flickered open. The void had changed. It was no longer empty. Shapes, figures, faint outlines of faces, hands, eyes watching her. They hovered in the shadows, just beyond her reach. The whisper grew louder, urgent. Megan. They were all around her now. The shapes weren't human. They were something else, shifting, changing, flickering in and out of existence. Eyes everywhere, staring at her, through her, cold, empty eyes. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the shapes closed in. A feeling of dread gripped her heart, tightening until she thought it would break. The darkness wasn't just empty. It was full of things that wanted her, that needed her. A sudden pull. Her body jerked violently, as if yanked by invisible strings. She gasped, her chest burning. The void stretched around her, and then light. A sliver of light. A crack, just in the distance. Her eyes fixed on it, desperate. She reached for it. Her arms trembled, her fingers grasping, aching for the light. But as she got closer, the pull intensified. The shadows clung to her like wet cloth, dragging her back. The whisper had become a chorus now, louder, unrelenting. Megan, her skin burned, her body racked with cold, like the very air was made of ice. She reached out with all the strength she had left. Her fingertips brushed the light. It flickered just for a second, and then a sharp, piercing pain in her chest. The shadows twisted violently around her, the light vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. And then, nothing. A void so deep, she couldn't tell if her eyes were even open. She felt weightless, suspended in endless black. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her chest tightening, fighting for air that wasn't there. She tried to move, but her body didn't respond. A dull ache spread across her limbs, as if they were slowly being crushed under an invisible weight. Time seemed to stretch, bend, break. Minutes? Hours? Days? She couldn't tell. Then a soft sound. A whisper. Her name. Megan. It wasn't the same voice as before. It was softer, more human, but still twisted. Her head snapped toward it, her body barely able to react. Megan. The voice was closer now, cold and familiar, like an echo from her past. Megan, why did you leave me? The shadows began to shift again. A shape, a form, was emerging from the darkness, slowly, creeping forward, as if it was watching her, waiting for her to notice. Her heart pounded louder, faster. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure took shape, and the room around her seemed to ripple, as if the very fabric of reality was bending under its presence. The figure was tall, draped in shadows. Its face, her face. It wasn't a reflection, though. It was something worse, a version of her that had been twisted, broken. Hollow eyes stared at her, unblinking, with a hunger in them that sent ice through her veins. The thing that looked like her stepped forward, its fingers stretched, reaching for her. Why did you leave me, Megan? The voice was full of agony, full of torment. Her chest tightened even more, her breath ragged. No, Megan whispered, her throat dry. No, I didn't leave you. The figure tilted its head, its smile widening. Oh, but you did. The world around her seemed to flicker again, the blackness swirling. The shadows twisted like living things, wrapping around her, pulling her toward the figure. Her limbs were heavy, unresponsive. She was sinking into the void again, deeper than before. Her pulse raced, frantic. She was slipping. The figure reached for her again, its eyes locked on hers. Megan, you left me behind. You left us. The words echoed, reverberating through her skull. And then there was a jolt, a sudden, violent tug. The figure's hand brushed against her face. Cold, ice cold. Her scream was swallowed by the dark. The cold seeped deeper, like a sharp, icy blade against her skin. Megan's body lurched, her chest tight as if the air itself had turned to ice. She couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. Her mind was spinning, drowning in the shadows. The figure's hand, still hovering near her, its fingers trembling, reached for her throat. Closer, closer. Her pulse was deafening now, each beat vibrating through her entire body. The room, if it could still be called a room, was warping again, bending and twisting, the walls stretching into infinity. The figure's hollow eyes stared into hers, its mouth curling into that terrible, hungry smile. "Megan, you don't remember, do you?" it whispered, its voice jagged, broken. "No," Megan gasped, her words a mere breath. I didn't leave you." The figure's grin widened, stretching impossibly wide, splitting its face. "Didn't you?" it asked, a mockery of her own voice. Her stomach lurched. The shadows around her began to writhe, tightening, pulling her closer to the figure. Each breath she tried to take felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. She couldn't escape. The darkness was consuming her, suffocating her. Her thoughts were slipping, scattered fragments she couldn't grasp. "Megan, remember," the figure coaxed. "You left me behind. You left us." Her mind screamed for an answer, but it was like trying to reach through water. What was it talking about? Who was it? The figure leaned closer, its cold breath against her ear. "You know you did." The shadows clawed at her skin, hot and cold at once, wrapping tighter. Megan's head spun, her vision blurring. And then, suddenly a memory surfaced, faint like a distant echo. A door, a hallway, her own footsteps hurried running. A sharp, fleeting image, a scream, a face familiar, distorted, locked behind a door. Asterisk no. Asterisk. The figure's hand moved to her neck, cold fingers brushing her skin. "Megan, you left me." Her heart raced, faster, faster, and then her body snapped forward, gasping for air, her chest heaving. The darkness was gone. She was back in the hallway, standing in front of a door. But this time, the door was different. The door was locked. The door stood before her, solid and unmoving. The air felt thick, heavy with the memory of something that wasn't quite real. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, cold to the touch. Her breath caught. Megan had been here before. She was sure of it. A feeling of dread washed over her, as if the door had been waiting for her. But the locked door, it wasn't just locked. It was waiting. Her fingers trembled as they hovered over the brass handle. Behind it, she knew there was something she had forgotten. The shadows she had left behind. Her pulse thudded in her ears as she twisted the handle. It didn't move. It refused. Her stomach churned. The whispers were back, faint but growing stronger. "Megan," that voice again. The figure from before, the face that mirrored her own, was waiting behind this door. She knew it. She could feel it. A desperate pull in her chest. The need to open it, to understand. Her breath came faster as she pressed her shoulder into the door. The cold metal bit into her skin. Her thoughts scattered, the past and present blending together in a blur of half-formed memories. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Megan." She slammed her shoulder into the door again, harder this time. The door groaned. The lock rattled. Her pulse spiked. She could almost feel it. Something was on the other side. The breath on her neck, the icy fingers reaching for her. No. She couldn't go back there. Her hands gripped the doorknob again, a frantic desperation clawing at her. With one final, desperate twist, the door gave way. It opened. The light inside flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the room. The air inside was stale, suffocating, thick with something she couldn't name. The door creaked as it swung wide. Her breath caught. It was a room she had never seen before. But it was too familiar. Everything inside was wrong. The walls cracked and peeling, the floor stained with dark, uneven patches, and in the center, asterisk or star, her reflection. Not the twisted thing she had seen before, but now this version of her was kneeling, face buried in her hands. Megan's heart skipped a beat. This time, there were no hollow eyes. This version of her was crying. "Megan," her voice cracked, muffled behind her hands. The room felt colder. Megan stepped forward, but her legs felt heavy, like she was moving through water. The reflection lifted her head slowly, revealing eyes that were not empty. They were full of fear. The same fear Megan felt deep in her chest. Megan, the voice, was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Her reflection was trembling. The room was closing in. Megan stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the trembling figure before her. Her reflection. But it wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was alive. It was her, but it wasn't. The room pulsed with an unsettling energy, as if it were alive, too. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the walls seemed to close in with every passing second. Megan's legs moved against her will, her body drawn toward the figure in the center of the room. Her reflection looked up, her eyes wide, full of something darker than fear. "Megan, don't—" the voice cracked, barely audible. Megan's heart pounded harder as she stepped closer. "What happened to you?" she whispered, her own voice barely recognizable. Her reflection didn't answer. It just stared, eyes filled with terror, as if warning her. "Please leave," the figure whispered again, this time with desperation. "It's not too late." Megan's breath hitched. She couldn't make sense of what she was seeing. The room, the reflection, none of it felt real. But it was real. Too real. She was standing in the middle of her own nightmare, and she didn't know how to wake up. The figure slowly stood up, her movements jerky, unnatural. "Get out, Megan. You have to leave," it repeated, stepping toward her with trembling hands, like it was trying to push her away. But Megan couldn't move. She could only stare at the figure, that familiar face twisted in anguish. The floor beneath them groaned, a deep, ominous sound that seemed to come from the very foundation of the room. "Megan," the figure whispered one last time. Then the room lurched. A deafening crack tore through the air. The walls, the floor, the very space around her. Everything seemed to collapse in on itself. The reflection screamed, a sound full of agony and fear. "Megan, no!" The shadows began to writhe, black tendrils reaching out from every corner of the room. Megan's pulse raced. She could feel the temperature drop sharply, her breath turning to mist in front of her. She wanted to run, but her feet felt like they were nailed to the floor. The reflection reached out with a trembling hand. Run. But it was too late. The room shattered. The darkness exploded forward, swallowing everything. Megan's heart stopped, and the world vanished. Everything went black. Not the kind of dark where your eyes adjust, but a suffocating, endless black. A weight pressed down on her chest, as though the very air had been stolen. Megan gasped, but no sound escaped. Her limbs felt heavy, distant, as if they weren't hers anymore. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The world was gone, leaving nothing but an oppressive silence. Then a flicker, a single moment of light, barely visible, a glimmer of something, a door. It was in the distance, but it didn't look like the one she'd just opened. This one was old, worn, but it felt real. Her body trembled as she forced herself toward it, her every step a struggle against the thick, unseen force weighing her down. Closer, closer. The light from the door grew stronger, though faint, almost as if it beckoned her, calling her by name. "Megan," the voice, her voice, but not quite. It echoed in her skull, sharp and cold. Her hand reached for the door handle. Trembling, she had to open it. She had to know what was on the other side. The handle was cold, too cold. It turned in her grasp. The door creaked open with a groan. A sliver of light spilled into the blackness, and through the crack, she saw something she didn't want to see. Her reflection. But this time, there were no shadows, no cracks in the walls. It was perfect, a perfect, familiar version of herself, smiling, not a smile of joy, but of something darker. "Welcome back," her reflection whispered, its voice smooth, too smooth. Megan stepped back, her heart racing in her chest. No, this wasn't right. "Megan, you always knew you couldn't escape," the reflection said, its eyes gleaming with something she couldn't name. The smile widened, almost inhuman. "Megan, you've always been here, and you always will be." The words cut through the silence like a blade. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the world collapsed. For a moment, everything was still, and then the laughter, low, hollow, unsettling. It echoed in every corner of her mind. Megan's eyes snapped open, but there was nothing, no door, no reflection, no escape, just the laughter, and the suffocating, endless dark. The laughter never stopped. It echoed, reverberating through her skull, filling her mind with its hollow, mocking tone. Megan's breath quickened, her body trembling, as if the very air around her was thickening with the weight of it. She closed her eyes, her hands pressing against her temples, trying to block out the sound. But it wouldn't stop. The darkness was suffocating, closing in tighter, pulling her deeper into its endless grip. She tried to scream, but no sound came. The shadows were everywhere now, crawling over her skin, creeping into her very soul. She was trapped in this place. Her chest tightened, her lungs burned. She opened her eyes again, though she didn't know why. It was the same, nothing but blackness, an empty void stretching on forever. But then, through the darkness, a faint glimmer of light appeared. At first, it was nothing more than a flicker, a flash in the distance. But it grew. It pulsed, drawing her toward it, like an invisible force. Megan moved, though her body felt weak, sluggish. She didn't know if she had the strength to keep going, but she couldn't stay here. She couldn't stay in the darkness. The light grew brighter as she moved toward it, the warmth of it almost comforting. She stepped forward. Another step. Her heart raced faster. Please, she thought, desperate. Please, let this be real. With each step, the light grew, illuminating the space around her. But when she reached it, when her hand reached out to grasp whatever it was, it flickered. The light vanished. Her fingers closed around nothing. No, her heart thudded in her chest. She tried to move, to turn, but the space had changed. The walls, the floor, everything was shifting again. It wasn't a room anymore. It was an endless corridor. The laughter returned, louder this time, vibrating through her bones. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to keep moving down the path. The walls seemed to press in on her, narrowing with every step. The shadows followed her, always just out of reach, but close enough to make her skin crawl. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Megan, her name. She spun around, but there was nothing but the darkness. It wasn't just a void anymore. It was alive, and it was watching her. Megan's pulse thundered in her ears. Her legs felt like lead, each step heavier than the last, as if the corridor itself was trying to pull her back into the shadows. The darkness pressed in tighter with every breath she took, every movement she made. Her heart beat faster, faster still, until she thought it might burst. And then a whisper. Megan, her name, barely audible, but unmistakable. It came from behind her. She didn't dare turn around. Her body screamed to run, but her feet refused to move. The whisper came again, closer this time, the sound crawling up her spine, ice cold. Megan? She spun around, her body trembling, eyes wide, searching the shadows. Nothing. But there was something someone in the distance. A figure, just a silhouette at first. Then, as the darkness shifted, it became clearer. Her heart skipped a beat. It was her, but it wasn't. The figure was taller. its features distorted and warped, like a cracked mirror reflecting a broken version of herself. Its eyes, empty, hollow, stared at her, unblinking, as though waiting for her to understand. "Come closer," the figure whispered, its voice a sickeningly sweet mockery of her own. Megan's legs shook as she stepped forward, drawn toward the figure, her body moving against her will. With every step, the figure's smile grew wider, more grotesque. "Megan, you've always known," it whispered, its voice trailing off like a forgotten memory. "You never escaped. You've always been here." The words felt like ice pouring into her veins. Megan stumbled back, shaking her head, her breath ragged. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, that's not true. I left." The figure's smile stretched impossibly wide, its eyes empty sockets of darkness. "You never left," it hissed. And then it stepped forward. The ground beneath Megan's feet trembled, the walls closing in. The figure's hand reached out toward her, long, thin fingers stretching unnaturally. The shadows reached for her, too, black tendrils curling around her legs, pulling her down. Megan fought, struggling to break free. But the figure's hand was closer now, so close, just inches from her face. "Megan, you can't run from yourself," it whispered, its voice wrapping around her like a vice. Her chest tightened. She couldn't breathe. The darkness was swallowing her whole, the air thickening, suffocating. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped. And then the world spun. The figure's face was inches from hers, its hollow eyes boring into hers. And with a final, sickening whisper, the figure spoke. "Welcome back, Megan." And everything went dark. The darkness felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating, relentless. Megan couldn't tell if her eyes were open or closed, if the world was real, or if she was still trapped in the void. She felt nothing. No air, no light, no sound, just that crushing, oppressive silence. Then a shiver ran through her body, a sharp, sudden sensation, a cold breath against her skin. Her eyes snapped open, but there was nothing to see, nothing to touch. She couldn't move. Her limbs felt frozen, like they weren't her own. Her heart pounded, the only sound she could hear, the only thing grounding her in this horrible, empty space. She opened her mouth to scream, but there was no sound. Please let it end. The thought screamed through her mind, but she didn't know where to go or what to do. And then a whisper, soft, low, familiar. "Megan." Her name echoed in the blackness. She flinched, her body jerking involuntarily. It was close, closer than before. She turned her head, heart racing, and then she saw it. A figure, standing just a few feet away in the darkness. Its form was indistinct, barely a silhouette, but it was there, watching. The whisper came again. "Megan." She tried to move, but her body refused to respond. Her eyes locked onto the figure, terrified, but unable to look away. The figure stepped forward, each movement deliberate, slow, as if savoring the moment. Megan's breath caught in her throat. It was her, but not. It wasn't the same. This one was wrong. This one moved like a shadow, fluid, but unnatural. It was her, but twisted, like some broken, jagged mirror. And the smile. The smile stretched too wide, too far, something grotesque and hollow in its expression. "Megan," it said again, its voice dripping with something that made Megan's skin crawl. "I thought you knew better." The figure reached out, its hand cold as ice, fingers elongating, sharp. Megan couldn't move. The hand hovered close to her face, the touch just beyond her skin. Her heart hammered in her chest. "Megan," it whispered once more, its breath hot and thick against her ear. The figure leaned in closer, its smile growing as it spoke again, low and sharp. "You can't run from me." And then, without warning, it reached for her. Everything seemed to collapse, the darkness closing in like a wave. The figure's hand closed around her throat, squeezing tighter, suffocating her. She gasped, but the air was gone. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. It was too much, too much. And just as her vision blurred, a sudden flash of light, bright, blinding, cut through the dark, and Megan fell through the blackness, deeper, faster, until nothing. She hit the ground with a sickening thud, a jolt that rattled her bones. Pain exploded through her body, but it was nothing compared to the suffocating grip that had held her just moments ago. Megan gasped, her lungs aching for air, but the breath she took was jagged, as if it couldn't fill her chest enough. She opened her eyes. It was bright, too bright. She blinked, trying to adjust, but the light was overwhelming, sharp, and blinding. The air was thick with dust and the faint scent of something burnt. Her head spun. Her hands trembled as they reached out, feeling for anything solid. The ground beneath her was cold, rough against her fingertips. A floor, a wooden floor. Her mind felt clouded, disjointed. But one thing was clear. She wasn't in the darkness anymore. She was somewhere else. Her breath was still unsteady, her chest heaving as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady, but she managed to find her balance. The room was small, bare, almost empty. The walls were peeling, the air stagnant, heavy with the smell of old paper and mildew. There were no windows, no doors, nothing to explain how she'd gotten here. Megan's pulse quickened as her mind raced. Where am I? She stumbled forward, her eyes scanning the room, trying to make sense of anything, and then she saw it. A mirror. It hung crookedly on the far wall, framed in tarnished silver, the glass clouded and cracked. Megan's heart skipped. She didn't want to look, but something in her compelled her to approach it. She stepped forward, her legs shaking beneath her. The reflection that stared back at her was wrong. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with panic, bloodshot. But there was something more, something she couldn't name. Her reflection's eyes weren't just filled with fear. They were watching her. And then, as if sensing her presence, the reflection's lips curled into a smile that wasn't hers. It stretched unnaturally wide, splitting its face. The figure in the mirror whispered, the words breathy and low. "You should have never opened that door, Megan." Her stomach dropped. Megan backed away, her breath ragged, her body trembling. The reflection didn't move, except for its smile, still wide, still mocking. "You're still here, Megan." The voice was hers, but distorted, warped by something darker. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. She turned, frantic, searching for a way out. But there was no escape. The walls were closing in, the mirror's mocking gaze growing more intense with every passing second. And then the whisper came again. "Megan, it's too late." The floor beneath her trembled. The room shook. And from the cracks in the walls, shadows began to creep in, winding through the floor like living things. Megan turned, her eyes wide with terror. Not again. But it was too late. The room was alive, and the shadows, the dark things that had followed her, were finally closing in. The mirror shattered. And the last thing Megan saw, before everything went black, was her reflection's grin. The darkness descended like a tidal wave, drowning everything in its path. Megan felt the weight of it pressing against her chest, suffocating her once again. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her body trembled, pinned beneath an invisible force, as the air grew thicker, heavier, like the very space around her was folding in. Then the whispers, soft at first, like a faraway breeze, but they grew louder, closer. Megan, her name, dragged through the air like a haunting melody. She tried to scream, but the sound was muffled, swallowed by the thick blackness. The shadows were moving. She could feel them, crawling over her skin, wrapping around her like cold hands. Their touch was electric, sharp, sending icy shivers down her spine. They knew her. The feeling was unmistakable. A voice, low and guttural, whispered in her ear, "You never left, Megan." Her eyes snapped open, but there was nothing to see. Nothing but a void that stretched on forever. She wanted to run, to fight, but her limbs wouldn't obey. Her body was frozen, trapped in the dark. And then movement. Something in the distance. A flicker of light. She strained her eyes, trying to focus. A door. It was ajar, just a crack, but it was there. The faintest sliver of light. Her heart pounded in her chest. I have to reach it. The thought burned through her mind, a spark of clarity in the chaos. She had to move. With all the strength she could muster, she forced her arms to move, her legs to push against the oppressive weight. She staggered forward, each step a battle, her breath ragged. Closer, closer to the light. The shadows reached for her, clawing at her legs, pulling at her. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Her fingers brushed the edge of the doorframe, and a jolt of energy surged through her. She shoved the door open, stumbling into a hallway, a long, narrow hallway, dimly lit by flickering overhead lights. The walls were cracked, the floor uneven, but it was real. She wasn't in the void anymore. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, plunging her back into complete darkness. Megan didn't turn back. She couldn't. She ran. Her feet pounded against the worn floorboards, her heart beating wildly in her chest as she sprinted down the hallway. She had to get out. She had to find a way out. At the end of the hallway, another door loomed, this one dark and solid. There was no light, but it felt different. It felt like the end. She didn't stop. With every ounce of strength, she crashed into it, her shoulders slamming against the wood. It didn't budge. Her breath came in desperate gasps. "Megan," the voice echoed again. But this time it wasn't just in her mind. It was real. It was behind her. She spun around, her body already primed to flee. But there was no one. Only darkness. Except she could feel it. The presence. The weight of something just beyond her reach. She took a step back, pressing against the door, her heart racing. And then a sound. A soft click. The door creaked open. The door groaned as it opened, revealing nothing but a sliver of dark space beyond. The air was thick, heavy with an unsettling chill that made her skin crawl. Megan hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to turn and never look back. But something asterisk, pulled her forward, urging her to step through the threshold. Her hand reached for the doorframe, trembling, but she forced herself to push it open wider. The door swung with a sharp screech, revealing a room. But it wasn't just any room. It was familiar. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old, dust-covered books, their spines cracked and weathered. The floor was littered with scraps of paper, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. It was the same room, the same as before, but different. Megan's eyes darted around, her chest tight with panic. She had been here, hadn't she? She recognized the peeling wallpaper, the narrow windows covered in grime. This was the place, her place, the one she had run from. Her reflection, her other self. She stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. But there was no mirror this time, only silence, and then the whisper again, closer, louder this time. "Megan," her body froze. The voice, the tone. It wasn't just an echo. It was real. She spun around, eyes wide, heart hammering in her chest. The figure was there, but it wasn't just a figure, it was her. Standing in the doorway, smiling. That smile, twisted, too wide, too cruel. stretched across the reflection of her face. "Megan," the figure whispered, its voice smooth, mocking. "I told you, you can't escape me." Megan's legs felt weak. Her mind was spinning, dizzy from the realization. This wasn't just her reflection. It was something else. Something darker. Something that had been waiting for her all along. The figure's smile grew. "Welcome back, Megan," it said, its eyes gleaming with malice. And then it stepped forward. The ground beneath Megan's feet trembled, the walls closing in, the shadows creeping from every corner of the room. Her heart raced, her breath shallow. She had nowhere to run. "Megan," it purred again, its voice sending chills through her entire body. "You knew. You always knew." Megan turned, desperate to flee, but the room stretched infinitely, the walls shifting, closing in, swallowing her whole. She couldn't escape, no matter how fast she ran. The figure's cold fingers brushed her shoulder, sending an icy jolt through her. "You never left," it whispered, the words dripping with finality. And in that moment the room faded. The darkness enveloped her once again. Her scream was swallowed by the void, and Megan disappeared. The void swallowed her whole, devouring the last trace of light. Megan's body felt weightless, suspended in nothingness. The air was suffocating, thick with silence. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The world around her was an endless, crushing blackness. The silence was maddening. Her mind screamed, but her voice didn't reach her ears. Time didn't exist here. There was no space, no sensation, no beginning or end. It was as though she had never existed. But then, the whisper came again, soft, faint, but unmistakable. Megan, her name, like a thread pulling her back from the abyss. It was the same voice, the same cold, mocking tone. She couldn't tell where it was coming from, above, below, all around her, as if the very air itself had been poisoned by it. Megan wanted to close her eyes, but they were already closed, as though her eyelids were sealed shut by the weight of the darkness. Megan, the voice was closer now, no longer a whisper, but a breath against her ear. She tensed, her skin crawling, but she couldn't move. And then a faint flicker, a shadow, a crack of light. It was so small, so faint at first, she almost thought it was another trick of the dark. But then it grew. A door. A real door this time. Megan's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a mirage. It wasn't another hallucination. It was there. She could feel it. She had to reach it. Her body finally responded. Her limbs moved, slowly at first, stiff and weak, but they obeyed. Each step was painful, like dragging herself through a pool of tar. But she had to get to the door. The light from it beckoned her, warm and alive. The shadows reached for her, crawling up her legs, grabbing at her ankles. But she forced herself to move faster, closer, closer, until finally her fingers brushed the cold handle of the door. She could feel it, feel asterisk, the way the handle thrummed under her touch, like it was alive, like it was pulling her in. Her heart pounded in her chest, deafening in the stillness of the void. She turned the handle. The door creaked open, and then the light flooded her vision, a blinding light, so bright, so sharp she had to squint. And as she stepped through, a new world unfolded before her. A room, but it was different, so different, clean, bright, untouched. The air smelled fresh, and the walls were smooth, unmarred by cracks or mildew. She stumbled forward, disoriented, her heart still racing. This was real, wasn't it? Her mind reeled as she tried to make sense of the surroundings, but everything fell off. The light was too perfect, the space too empty. There was a desk, a chair, and a strange, ornate mirror hanging on the far wall. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't the same. Her reflection was smiling, calm, at peace. Megan felt her chest tighten. Her reflection raised a hand, not to wave or greet her, but to beckon. A silent invitation. Megan's body moved before she could think. Her legs carried her forward, drawn to the mirror, drawn to the calmness, the peace it promised. She stepped closer. Her reflection's smile widened. Megan, it whispered, its voice soft, coaxing. And Megan, Megan asterisk, couldn't stop herself. She reached out. Her hand trembled as it hovered just before the surface of the glass. The reflection in the mirror stared back, its eyes gleaming with something darker. The moment her fingers brushed the cool glass, the room shattered. Cracks spread across the mirror, splintering the illusion. The walls cracked, the floor shifted. Megan screamed, but her voice was lost in the roar of the shattering world around her. Everything fell apart, and just like that, she was gone. The world crumbled, piece by piece, as if the very fabric of reality had unraveled. Megan's scream was swallowed by the chaos, by the relentless, tearing sound that echoed through the void. Her hands reached out, desperately trying to grab hold of something. Anything, but there was nothing. The floor beneath her feet had vanished, leaving nothing but an endless fall into the darkness. She plummeted, faster, faster. Her body twisted and turned, the air rushing past her, and her mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts, none of them clear, none of them able to make sense of what was happening. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The blackness was swallowing her whole. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The free fall ended. The roaring silence returned. Megan's body hit something solid, stone, cold and unforgiving, and she crumpled to the ground, gasping for air. She struggled to push herself up, her limbs weak, her head spinning. Where was she now? She glanced around. Nothing. Just a cold, desolate space. No walls. No floor. No ceiling. Only a shadow that stretched endlessly in every direction. Her breath was ragged, shallow, as though the air itself didn't want to let her breathe. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, and for a moment she thought she might pass out. But something caught her attention. A flicker. A light. It was far in the distance, barely visible through the blackness, but it was there. A beacon. Megan pushed herself to her feet, her knees shaking, and took a step toward it. Each movement felt like a struggle. Every breath felt like she was pulling against a force that didn't want her to exist. But the light, it was different. It called to her, louder than the shadows, louder than the silence. Step after step, her heart raced as the light grew closer. But as she drew nearer, she realized it wasn't just a light. It was a door standing alone in the dark, glowing faintly, beckoning her toward it. Megan's breath caught in her throat. This door, it was different. She reached for the handle, her hand trembling as it brushed against the cold metal. She hesitated. What would happen if she opened it? Was this escape, or was it just another trap? She closed her eyes for a moment, her mind racing. But then she pulled the door open. It creaked slowly, as though protesting her intrusion. On the other side was nothing. More darkness, more silence. But Megan stepped through anyway, and when her feet hit the ground, the door slammed shut behind her with a force that made the air tremble. She turned. The door was gone. The light was gone. All that remained was her reflection. It stood before her, perfectly still, smiling, grinning, that same twisted, mocking smile. Megan's chest tightened. She reached out, but her reflection didn't move, didn't speak. She tried to step forward, but something held her back. She looked down. Her feet weren't on solid ground anymore. The floor beneath her was shifting, changing, sinking. And then, from the darkness, a voice spoke, its tone soft but unmistakable. "You never left, Megan." Her reflection's smile grew wider. Megan's body went rigid as the voice echoed around her, filling the space with its hollow, insidious tone. "You never left, Megan." The words clawed at her mind, scraping at the edges of her sanity. She felt the ground beneath her feet tremble, cracks spidering across the surface. Her reflection, the twisted version of herself, watched her with those dark, empty eyes, still smiling, that cruel, unbearable smile. She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't. Her legs wouldn't move. Her heart thudded in her chest, louder now, each beat like a drum of impending doom. The floor beneath her began to crack open, jagged, sharp lines spreading like a web, pulling apart everything she thought she knew. With every breath, the darkness seemed to grow, crawling toward her, crawling into her, filling her lungs with the stench of decay. She tried to step back, but the void was swallowing her, pulling at her feet, its cold fingers wrapping around her ankles. The reflection's smile never faltered. "Why do you keep running?" it whispered, its voice laced with venom. "You can't outrun yourself." The shadows surged forward, and with it, the overwhelming sensation of being pulled into something darker, something she couldn't escape. Megan's stomach lurched. The ground beneath her fractured, splitting wide open. She fell, not into darkness this time, but into a vast, endless pit, the walls smooth and unyielding. She couldn't scream, couldn't speak. Her body just tumbled, spinning, caught in the endless fall. Everything felt like it was stretching, her thoughts, her body, her very soul, being torn apart by the force of the fall. She was falling, but she didn't know where to. And just before the pit swallowed her whole, just before the last shred of her consciousness vanished, a voice, this time her own, whispered in her mind, "Asterisk, you can't escape who you are. Asterisk." The darkness claimed her then, pulling her into itself, and everything, everything asterisk, faded away. Megan was gone, but in the silence, her reflection remained, still smiling, and it waited. Megan's senses faded, her body heavy, as if it were dissolving into the void. The swirling shadows, the constant whisper of her name, they all became distant echoes. She felt nothing but an oppressive weight that pressed against her chest. And then, just as the darkness threatened to consume her entirely, there was a shift, a change. A faint light began to flicker, far off in the distance. At first, it seemed like a mirage, a trick of her fractured mind. But it grew. It pulsed stronger now, like a heartbeat. The shadows around her receded, slowly, reluctantly. The oppressive weight lifted, just a little, enough for her to take a shallow breath. The ground beneath her feet was solid again, warm even. The air was different, clear, clean, the scent of rain and earth, like a fresh start. Megan blinked, disoriented, her body trembling. She wasn't falling anymore. She wasn't trapped. The void had given way to something real, something she could touch. She opened her eyes fully, taking in her surroundings. She was standing in a meadow. The sky was a soft blue, the sun just beginning to dip below the horizon, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Wildflowers swayed gently in the breeze, their colors vibrant and alive. Birds chirped in the distance. It was peaceful, so peaceful. Megan took a step forward, her breath shaky, but steadying with each movement. She looked around, confused. She was alive. She was free. For the first time, she felt a small flicker of hope, but then she heard it, a soft, familiar whisper. Her name, Megan. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned, but there was no one there. The meadow was empty. It was quiet now, too quiet, as if the world was holding its breath. And there, standing just at the edge of the field, a figure appeared. She couldn't see it clearly at first. Just a shadow, a silhouette, but as it stepped closer, she felt the familiar weight of its presence. It was her. Megan froze. The figure smiled, the same twisted, mocking grin that had haunted her. The silence stretched, suffocating. Megan, it said again, its voice sweet, deceptively calm. And Megan realized, this wasn't over. It had never been over.